So far in this section, we've only covered how to use a low-level dependency injection API. But with Angular, we'll never actually need to create injectors ourselves. Angular does this for us automatically when our application is bootstrapped. All we need to do is to configure Angular with our providers and also tell it when we want something injected into a class constructor. And that's the topic of this lecture. By the end of this lecture, you're going to know what is the injector tree and how it maps to the component tree. You're going to know how and where to configure injectors in Angular. And you're going to know when to use the inject and injectable decorators. But you're also going to know when we don't need to use the inject and injectable decorators. So an Angular application will have a tree of injectors mirroring the component tree. So in the slide right now, I've split it up into two. On the left-hand side, you're going to see the injector tree, and on the right-hand side, you're going to see the component tree. So we'll always have a top-level parent injector, which is attached to our ng module. Then we'll have child injectors descending in a hierarchy matching the component tree. So imagine we have a parent component. We will then also have a child injector stemming from ng module linked to this parent component. And if our parent component had a child component, that child component would then have a child injector stemming from the parent injector. That's the injector tree, and that's how it's linked to the component tree. So now let's start having a look at how we can configure injectors in Angular. So as I said, the ng module has an injector, a top-level injector, and how we configure it is via a property called providers on our ng module decorator. And this property accepts a list of providers in exactly the same way as we would pass to the reflective injector via the resolve and create function, which we've been using so far in this course. So if I added to the providers array, let's say a class called email service, and a class called job service, this then creates a top-level parent injector and configures it with two class providers, email service and job service. We can also configure our components and also our directives the same way by using a property called providers on the component and directive decorator. So in this example here, in our main app component, I've configured the providers property with the email service, and now our app component will have an injector, a child injector of the main ng module injector, but that child injector is only configured with the email service. But with components, we have another property called view providers. And this creates a special injector that resolves dependencies only for this component's view children and doesn't act as a parent injector for any content children. And we'll be going through specific examples of each of these different ways of configuring injectors in the next lecture. So this is how we configure dependency injection in Angular. When Angular creates a component, it uses the DI framework to figure out what to pass to the component class constructor as parameters. However, we may need to give Angular some hints by using either the inject or injectable decorators. So I'm going to explain with an example. I'm going to create a class. I've created a class called other service and another class called simple service. I'm first going to, I'll remove the view providers on our component. I'm first going to add these classes to our main ng module as providers. And then to make Angular resolve and create a simple service, we add a component which requests an instance of simple service via its constructor. So I'm just going to create a component, a copy and paste a component here, a component called simple. Just has a very simple template. In fact, it's not template URL, it's just template. And in our simple component constructor, I want to pass in an instance of simple service. Now if I configure this component in our declarations, and now if we run the application, let me open up. There we can see our simple component is just being rendered on the page. It just says simple is as simple does. There's no errors in the console. Oh, let me rerun so you can see that was an old error. Let me rerun it so you know that was an old error. And there you can see there's no errors in the console. So we know that Angular is injecting this correctly, or at least it's not having any problems injecting this into our simple component. If we go on to our simple service class, let's try and inject into simple service an instance of other service. So in the constructor for simple service, I'm now adding in the fact that, well, we need other service as well. Now remember, we're not creating simple service ourselves. The Angular DI framework is creating simple service when it's trying to inject it into simple component. But to create an instance of simple service, we also need an instance of other service. Let's see what happens when we try and run this. We actually get an error in the console. So if we have a look, the error is can't resolve all parameters for simple service. So even though we've told, or even though we've added other service to the constructor for simple service, we need to explicitly tell Angular what we want injected for the other service parameter. And to do that, we use the inject decorator. Now inject comes from Angular core, so we need to import it in, or we need to remember to import it in. And the inject decorator, well, it's a parameter, it's an argument decorator, so we prepend our other service argument with it. And the first parameter to inject is the token we want to resolve this dependency with. Now, since we configured our provider with classes, the token is the actual class name. So now if we rerun our application, let me clear the console. If we rerun our application, this should work. And now it's working. When Angular tries to construct the simple service class, it knows that it needs to get an instance of the other service from the DI framework using the token other service. But decorating all of our constructor arguments with inject can be really tiresome. So instead we can decorate our entire class with the injectable decorator. And now if I rerun our application, also we've got to remember to import it in. And if we rerun the application, everything's running fine again. So injectable is actually just a shortcut for having to decorate every parameter in your constructor with inject. It does this for you behind the scenes by looking at the types of each parameter. So if we don't supply a type, injectable doesn't work. So if we didn't supply a type for our constructor parameter, if I just said it was any, and now I try to rerun the application, it's not going to work. It's going to give us a similar error to before. It's now saying cannot resolve all parameters for simple service. And that's because it's using the type of the parameter as the token to request to try and resolve from the DI framework. So if we provide the class in again, that's going to work. Now personally, I believe the name for the injectable decorator is just really confusing. The name implies that you need to decorate a class with injectable to inject it into other classes. But it's really just a shortcut for having to decorate every parameter in your constructor with inject. By decorating a class with injectable, it just means the constructor can be injected into. And I think it probably should be named auto inject or something like that to reduce confusion. So that's the injectable decorator. Well, that's the inject and injectable decorator. And you might be asking the question, why didn't we use the injectable decorator on the component when we injected simple service? That's because all of the other decorators in Angular, such as the component decorator or the directive decorator, already perform the same function as injectable. So we only need to use injectable on classes, we only need to use injectable on classes where we're trying to inject something into, but also we only need to use injectable on classes which don't already use one of the other Angular decorators. So to summarize, there is one top-level injector created for each ng module, and then for each component in our application, from the root component down, there is a tree of injectors created which map to the component tree. We configure these injectors with providers by adding the configuration to either the providers property on ng module, component, and directive decorators, or to the view providers property on the component decorator. We use the inject parameter decorator to instruct Angular that we want to resolve a token and inject a dependency into a constructor. And we use the injectable class decorator to automatically resolve and inject all the parameters of a class constructor. But this only works if each parameter has a TypeScript type associated with it, which the DI framework uses as a token. And we don't need to use the injectable class decorator on classes which are already decorated with one of the other Angular decorators, such as @component. Now we know where we can configure providers in the DI framework in Angular. In the next lecture, we're going to cover the differences between configuring providers on ng module, component.providers, and component.viewProviders.